Early March 1943, Port Moresby. A single wrench falls from oil-dark hands, and everything about one bomber suddenly looks wrong. What the man standing there has helped create would not appear in any manual. 8 forward-firing .50 caliber guns where glass bombardier's nose once was. This wasn't a factory design or a sanction project. It was born in a maintenance hangar, built by a grieving, stubborn mechanic with a pilot's instinct. The bomber in front of him is the same B-25 Mitchell that Americans had flown to bomb at altitude for years. But now it's something else, a gunship made to hunt ships. And whether it will save thousands of lives or land its creator in a courtroom is a decision that will be made in the next few hours. But the real question is how one man reached that wrench and rivet moment. But that wasn't the whole story. 2 years before, on December 8, 1941, Manila burned. Paul Irvin Gunn, later called Pappy by a few who knew him, watched Japanese bombers tear the American Air Forces apart. He was 42 then, managing civilian aircraft for Philippine Airlines, a man with 2 decades of hands-on aviation experience. Mechanic, pilot, instructor. Within hours, his civilian planes were seized, and he was commissioned into the Army Air Forces. He would survive being shot down, fly unarmed transports through hostile skies to deliver medicine, and earn a Distinguished Flying Cross. But survival had a cost. His wife and 4 children were trapped as civilians under Japanese control. That private loss hardened into a public obsession. He decided then that if he could not reach them, he would end the enemy's ability to feed the war machine that held them. The tool he chose? Aviation, reshaped by his hands. And it would take more than courage to turn that idea into action. The Allied air campaign in the Southwest Pacific was failing in one crucial task: sinking ships. High-altitude bombing gave ships time to maneuver. Results were abysmal. General George C. Kenney, recently installed to fix the disaster, believed the answer lay in low-level attacks, skip bombing, practically stone-skipping bombs across the water to strike hulls below the armor belt. The theory existed, but so did the problem. Approaching ships at mast height meant facing concentrated anti-aircraft fire with no way to suppress the guns. Then word reached Kenney about an unauthorized tinkerer in the 3rd Attack Group, a man who had been converting aircraft in ways the regulations didn't allow. Kenney could have punished him. Instead, he saw potential and asked for one simple thing: make these conversions work at scale. That choice would change doctrine and the course of a campaign. And the man chosen to carry it out had a personal stake deeper than orders or doctrine. Paul Gunn was not an engineer on paper. He was a sailor-turned-mechanic, a teacher at Pensacola once, a man who'd crashed and rebuilt enough planes to know how metal behaved under stress. Working long days in crude workshops, he scavenged guns from wrecked fighters, fashioned mounts in the middle of the night, and tested each hack himself. His first successes came on smaller .20 Havocs. Remove the bombardier, bolt heavy guns into the nose, and use strafing to silence defenders before dropping bombs. The results were immediate and brutal, aircraft-destroying attacks that stunned commanders and terrified defenders. Gunn's methods were rough, and many of his superiors would have called them illegal. But Kenney saw results, and results meant lives saved. So Gunn, a man driven by anger, loss, and ruthless practicality, was handed responsibility to scale the idea up. What he did next would push a medium bomber into a new role entirely. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed to be a naval hunter. It was a medium-altitude, level bomber, twin engines, a crew of 5, a bombardier's glass nose. But Gunn saw room in that nose for heavy weapons. In Townsville maintenance hangars, he and a co-conspirator from North American Aviation removed the fragile glass nose and filled the void with Browning .50 caliber guns. They mounted guns in cheek blisters, locked a dorsal turret forward, and figured out how to make 8 heavy weapons fire in one sweep. The conversion created a gunship with the range and payload to threaten Japanese supply lines far from shore. Guns solved harmonization problems, reinforced structures, and adapted the plane's balance. These were not blueprints in the book. They were solutions hammered out one broken part at a time, trial and error made urgent by war and by personal grief. But hardware alone wouldn't win the day. Tactics would have to be reinvented around it. The tactic they perfected was shock itself. Modified B-25s would fly at mast height, sometimes 50 feet above the sea, at almost 300 miles per hour. At 1,000 yards, they opened up with all forward guns, walking the barrage toward a ship to shred gun crews and superstructures. Then, within seconds, they'd release delayed fuse bombs set to skip across the water and slam into the hull below the armor belt. The bomb would detonate after penetration, the underwater blast tearing keels and flooding engineering spaces. The attack lasted maybe 10 seconds from first tracer to impact. It combined suppression and precision in a way older doctrine hadn't anticipated. It also required nerves. Closing on an escorted convoy at that speed left no time to correct mistakes. But when multiple aircraft coordinated with high-altitude bombers and fighters overhead, the result became terrifyingly efficient. And all of this would be tested against a target the Japanese consider vital. In late February 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted plans for a major Japanese convoy steaming from Rabaul to reinforce New Guinea. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, and thousands of troops. If those reinforcements arrived, they might blunt the Allied advance. Kenny saw a chance. Throw everything at the convoy and see if the new weapons and tactics held up. The strike force assembled included high-altitude B-17s, P-38 escorts, RAF fighters, and the newly converted B-25 strafers. Weather delayed contact for a day, and the convoy pressed on, slow and heavily laden. By March 3rd, the sky cleared and the Allies converged. The plan was audacious. Use bombing to distract and force maneuver, then send in low-level attackers to finish the job. What unfolded that morning would rewrite naval logistics in the theater. The attack began in waves. High-altitude bombers harried the convoy and drew fighters away. Then low-level attackers struck. Bow fighters and B-25 strafers screamed in, guns blazing. The modified Mitchells brought a storm of metal to bear. 8 forward .50s, cheek guns, turret guns locked forward. Literally the concentrated punch of multiple fighters delivered by a bomber with bombs. Tracers painted targets. Anti-aircraft crews were cut down. Then the skip bombs did their work. Ships rocked, flooded, broke in two, and burned. Destroyers that tried to cover the transports were hit again and again. In under an hour, transports sank, escorts blew apart, and hundreds of troops and sailors were in the water. The scene was apocalyptic. The strike force withdrew to rearm and then returned to finish what they had started. By nightfall, the convoy lay shattered. The scale of the destruction stunned both sides and made doctrine obsolete overnight. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a single coordinated attack, brutal and surgical, became a turning point. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were lost. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed or stranded. Allied losses were comparatively light. More important than raw numbers was the strategic message. Land-based aircraft, when coordinated with intelligence and new tactics, could annihilate escorted convoys. Japan could no longer safely move large reinforcements by sea within range of Allied air bases. They shifted to night movements, submarines, and barges, all less efficient and far more vulnerable. Gunn's field-built strafers had proven practical on a huge scale. His illegal tinkering in maintenance sheds had just imposed a severe logistical penalty on the enemy. But a dramatic victory does not end a man's private war. Even as the modified B-25s were celebrated and their tactics copied across the theater, Paul Gunn's family remained imprisoned in Santo Tomas. Letters sometimes trickled through. Conditions worsened as Japan's resources dwindled. Gunn never stopped fighting, physically or emotionally. He kept refining aircraft, training crews, and arguing that combat effectiveness mattered more than procedural purity. Industry eventually took notice. North American aviation engineers visited his workshops and incorporated many of his field fixes into factory designs. Gunn would later travel to U.S. plants to help design production strafers, and models with heavier cannon followed. But the cost had been personal and severe. The innovations that saved lives were also forged in rage and loss, a reminder that necessity often drives change no regulations foresee. Next, the rapid adoption, production changes, and the painful wounds that would end Gunn's flying days, but not his legacy. By mid-1943, the modified B-25s, now called Strafer bombers, were rolling off assembly lines with factory-installed gun packages. What Gunn had done in a jungle workshop was now being mass-produced by North American aviation. Each new aircraft carried 8 forward guns, extra armor, and rocket mounts under the wings. Pilots arriving in theater called them Pappy Specials. Their combat debut proved that engineering from the field could outpace the bureaucracy of war. Gunn's improvisations became doctrine. Hit hard, hit low, leave fast. He refused to accept credit publicly, often saying, "I just wanted the boys to come home." But among mechanics, his name carried weight. If Pappy touched your aircraft, it would fly, no matter what. And that reputation brought him new responsibilities far from the front lines. General Kinney wanted Gunn to help reshape maintenance logistics for the entire 5th Air Force. Gunn's field crews could tear down and rebuild a bomber in hours using scrap parts. They turned wreckage into reinforcements. He began designing modular kits to convert ordinary planes into strafers quickly, a form of battlefield engineering long before it had a name. Reports claim Kinney often said, "Give me one gun in every squadron and I'll win this war twice as fast." The U.S. Air Force tried to document his methods, but much of what he did was instinctive, felt rather than calculated. He could hear an engine idle and diagnose a cracked fuel line before anyone else touched the wrench. But the strain of constant work and emotional exhaustion was beginning to show. Sleep was rare. Gunn lived in hangars, writing notes on the backs of fuel manifests, often ignoring orders that didn't make sense to him. His temper was legendary. Once, when an officer questioned his unauthorized repairs, Gunn reportedly snapped, "You want a form or a fighter? Pick one." Yet beneath the anger lay heartbreak, the same grief that fueled his obsession. Letters from his wife Margaret spoke of illness and hunger inside the internment camp. Each word tightened the knot in his chest. Every plane he built became an outlet for that pressure, a way to strike back at the system that had taken his family. His friends worried he wouldn't survive the war, even if the bullets missed him. But fate would give him one last miracle before it took everything else away. In early 1945, Allied troops liberated Manila. Among the civilians rescued from Santo Tomas were Margaret Gunn and the couple's 4 children. Emaciated but alive, they were reunited months later when Paul finally returned from Australia. Witnesses said the hard, grease-covered man who stepped off the transport melted into tears the moment he saw his family. For a brief time, the war hero became just a father again. He took a post-war commission, helped reorganize military aviation maintenance, and lectured about field efficiency. Yet he remained uncomfortable with medals or ceremonies. When journalists asked what invention he was most proud of, he answered quietly, "Keeping men alive." But peace was not a comfortable state for a man who had lived by constant motion. After the war, Gunn returned to the Philippines, the land where both his tragedy and triumph had begun. He opened a small aviation business, repairing aircraft for civilian use, and helped rebuild local airfields. To many locals, he was simply the American who never left. His children described him as restless, always fixing something, always scanning the sky. Though he carried the quiet satisfaction of survival, he also carried invisible scars. He rarely spoke of combat, but occasionally told mechanics how a plane doesn't care who's right, only who understands it. His workshops echoed with laughter and the clang of tools, reminders that creation had once been his way of fighting despair. But even legends meet their final flight. On October 11th, 1957, Paul "Pappy" Gunn took off from Manila in a civilian Beechcraft. The weather turned violent, heavy clouds swallowing the mountains. Radio contact faded. When search planes finally found the wreckage, there were no survivors. He was 57 years old. The news spread quietly through veteran networks. Most of his wartime friends were scattered across bases and countries. Few outside the Air Force even knew his name, yet his fingerprints were on every low-altitude gunship that followed. His death marked the end of a chapter written not by generals, but by mechanics who refused to wait for permission to win. And history would take years to realize what his defiance had truly built. Historians later credited Gunn with inventing a new category of aircraft, the attack bomber. His jungle-built modifications inspired later designs like the A-26 Invader, the A-1 Sky Raider, and, decades later, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, all aircraft defined by heavy guns and low-altitude endurance. He showed that adaptability, not bureaucracy, was the soul of air power. In the post-war years, technical manuals began citing field innovation principles derived from his work. What engineers formalized, Gunn had done by instinct and desperation. Every gunship that thundered over Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq carried echoes of that first hacked-together B-25 from 1943. But the legacy of man is measured by memory as much as machinery. To this day, veterans' reunions in the Pacific still tell his stories about the mechanic who argued with generals, the pilot who fought with his hands, and the father who rebuilt planes because he couldn't rebuild time. Rumors suggest he sometimes flew missions long after he'd been grounded, just to make sure his planes performed as intended. Whether those stories are fact or folklore, they reveal the truth about his legend. People believe in him not because of rank, but because of results. Gunn proved that war, for all its chaos, still has room for genius born of necessity. In hangars filled with rust and oil, he found victory through innovation. And even in modern skies, that spirit still flies. Look closely at every generation of aircraft since each is a little more modular, more reparable, more field-ready. That mindset traces directly back to Pappy Gunn's stubborn refusal to follow the rulebook. His life is a case study in practical innovation. How personal grief can fuel genius. How chaos can become clarity when channeled through purpose. The man who once built bombers with scrap metal and fury ended up redefining how air forces think about adaptability. It said that when he couldn't find the right tool, he'd make one. That single phrase could summarize his life. When tools failed, he forged new ones. But there's still one last lesson hidden in his story.